She was 9 years old. She weighed 60 pounds. She had a dog named Shep, a grandmother who baked oatmeal cookies, and a heart full of hope about earning a sales badge before the end of the week. On a cold Friday afternoon in March of 1959, she laced up her shoes, picked up 7 small boxes of campfire mints, kissed her grandmother goodbye, and walked out her front door into a neighborhood she had known her entire life. She never walked back through it. Not that evening. Not ever. And the man who made sure of that spent the next 6 decades living just a few blocks away, sleeping in a bed, eating at a table, breathing the same air as the family he had destroyed, while 3 generations of detectives burned their careers trying to find him. This is the story of Candy Rogers. This is the story of what was taken from her, what was taken from Spokane, and what it finally took to bring the truth into the light 62 years after the streetlights came on and she did not come home. If this is your first time here at Cold Case Beasts, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the bell so you never miss the moment we crack one open. We dig into the cases that time tried to bury. We do not let them stay cold. Now let's go back to 1959, because this story begins long before the search parties and the helicopters and the evidence lockers. It begins on an ordinary street in an ordinary American city where nobody thought anything like this could ever happen. And that is exactly where it always begins. Spokane, Washington in 1959 was the kind of city that existed in a particular American moment that would not last much longer. It was a working city. A practical city. A place where people got up before sunrise, went to jobs that asked something real of their bodies, came home to modest houses on modest streets, and raised their children in the belief that the neighborhood itself was a kind of safety net. West Central Spokane, the neighborhood where Candy Rogers lived, was exactly that kind of place. The houses were not large. The cars and the driveways were not new. But the porches were used, the sidewalks were walked, and the names of the people on every block were known by the people on every other block. It was the kind of neighborhood where a grandmother standing on the front steps could look down the street and see a dozen children she recognized by name, by face, by the sound of their laughter. That familiarity was not just comfort. People believed, in a way that was completely genuine and completely reasonable by the standards of that era, that knowing your neighbors was the same as being safe among them. They were wrong. But they did not know that yet. Candy Rogers lived in an apartment above a neighborhood grocery store on the 2000 block of West Mission Avenue. Her mother, Elaine, was a high school history and physical education teacher, a woman who worked hard and kept a disciplined, loving home for her daughter. Elaine was the kind of mother who showed up. She showed up at Candy's school events. She showed up at campfire meetings. She showed up every day in the life of a little girl who was, by every account of everyone who knew her, a genuinely sweet and gentle child. Candy was small. Small even by the standards of 9-year-olds in 1959. 4 feet and 4 inches tall. 60 pounds. She was not the kind of child who dominated a room or commanded attention simply by walking into it. She was quiet. A little shy. The kind of child who watched first and spoke second, who listened carefully and meant everything she said. But inside that small, quiet exterior was something real and determined and hopeful. You could see it in the way she talked about her Campfire Girls membership. She was a bluebird. At exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Candy Rogers picked up her 7 boxes of campfire mints, said her goodbyes, stepped through the front door of her home, and walked out into the cold March air. The Pacific Northwest in early March is a particular kind of cold. It is not the aggressive, theatrical cold of the deep winter months. It is a quieter cold, a stubborn cold, the kind that settles into the shoulders and reminds you that spring has been promised but not yet delivered. The sky holds light longer than it did in January, but not long enough. Darkness in early March in Spokane comes fast and comes early, and everyone who lived there knew it. Especially the children, who had been told, in the way that parents of that era told children things, firmly and without excessive explanation, that the rule was simple. Be home before the streetlights come on. Candy knew the rule. She had always followed the rule. There was no reason on the afternoon of March the 6th, 1959, to believe she would not follow it again. The neighborhood was familiar. The doors she was planning to knock on were doors she had seen 100 times. The faces she expected to open them were faces she recognized. She was not going far. She was not going anywhere strange or unfamiliar. She was doing something she had planned and prepared for and been excited about for weeks. She stepped out into that cold afternoon air and she started knocking on doors. And then, at some point in the hour and a half that followed, somewhere on the streets of West Central Spokane, on a cold Friday afternoon while other little girls in identical uniforms were knocking on identical doors just blocks away, something happened to Candy Rogers that should never have happened to any child anywhere. Something that was not an accident. Something that was not a tragedy in the random, impersonal sense of that word. Something that was a choice. A deliberate, predatory choice made by a person who had looked at a street full of children and identified the smallest, most harmless, least likely to resist, most impossible to save. And then acted on that identification with the cold, practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before. Or something close enough to it. At 5:30 in the evening, when Candy had still not come home, her grandfather stepped outside. He was not panicked yet. Children sometimes lost track of time. Children sometimes got caught up in a conversation on someone's porch or found themselves one more block further than they had planned. He walked to the neighbors. He checked the familiar houses. He asked the familiar faces. Nobody had seen Candy recently. Nobody could say with certainty where she was or which direction she had gone. Her mother, Elaine, arrived home from a hair appointment during these first searching minutes, stepping from the ordinary routine of her Friday afternoon into the beginning of the worst experience of her life. She had been gone an hour. Her daughter had been gone longer. The gap between those two facts was already beginning to feel like something it should not feel like. Within the hour, the search had expanded. Family members moved through the surrounding streets. Voices called Candy's name into the early evening air. The neighborhood, which had felt so safe and familiar just hours before, was taking on a different quality in the failing light. By nightfall, the police had been called. The problem that detectives faced from the very first hours of that search was one that no amount of goodwill or manpower could fully solve. Candy Rogers was not the only campfire girl selling mints in West Central Spokane on the evening of March the 6th, 1959. There were dozens of them. Little girls in the same blue uniforms, carrying the same white boxes, moving through the same streets at the same time. Witnesses who had opened their doors to a small girl with mint boxes that evening could not say with certainty whether the child they remembered was Candy or one of the other girls who looked just like her from a distance on a darkening street. The uniformity that was a point of pride for the Campfire Girls organization became, in those first desperate hours of the search, an obstacle to finding one specific child among many. The trail, from the very beginning, was thin. Then, at approximately 9 o'clock in the evening, searchers made a discovery that changed the nature of the investigation entirely. On Pettit Drive, a road that climbs the slope of a hill that Spokane locals have called Doomsday Hill for as long as anyone can remember, boxes of campfire mints were scattered across the ground. Not dropped. The word matters. Not the accidental scatter of a child who had tripped or been startled. Scattered. The pattern of the boxes on the ground, the distance between them, the direction they were spread, all of it pointed toward something that no parent in that neighborhood wanted to believe. Some of the boxes appeared to have been thrown from the window of a moving vehicle, thrown in the hurried, careless way of someone driving away fast from a place they needed to leave quickly. The trail of scattered boxes led south, across the Fort George Wright Bridge, away from Candy's neighborhood, away from everything familiar, into a part of the city that Candy Rogers had no reason to go. One of those mint boxes had something on its surface that made detectives hold their breath. A partial fingerprint. Clear enough to lift. Clear enough to preserve. Clear enough to send to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Forensic Laboratory, which in 1959 represented the highest level of criminal identification science available anywhere in the country. The partial print was carefully lifted from the box. It was carefully preserved. It was sent to the FBI. And it was never identified. Not in 1959. Not in the years that followed. Not for decades. The technology simply was not there yet. The database of prints to compare it against was not comprehensive enough. The print sat in a file, a perfect silent witness to a crime that could not yet speak. By 9 o'clock on the night of March 6, 1959, there was no longer any reasonable doubt about what had happened to Candy Rogers. She had not gotten lost. She had not wandered into an unfamiliar part of the city. She had not gotten confused about the time or the route or the rule about the streetlights. Someone had taken her. Someone had seen a 9-year-old girl on a public street in broad afternoon daylight, carrying 7 boxes of mints, and had made the decision, in cold and deliberate calculation, to take that child away. The question that kept Spokane awake that night was not what had happened. The question was who. And the answer to that question, the true answer, the answer that would hold up 62 years later under the scrutiny of advanced forensic science, was hiding in plain sight. Walking through the same neighborhood. Breathing the same air. Possibly standing in the same search groups, calling the same name into the same dark streets. By the morning of March 7, every person in Spokane, Washington knew that Candy Rogers was missing. Word had moved through the city with the speed that only a story about a missing child can move, the speed that comes from the particular horror of imagining your own child in that situation, the particular urgency that makes strangers into family and turns a neighborhood into a single organism with a single purpose. And more than 1,200 of those people showed up before sunrise to find her. 1,200 people. For one little girl. Think about what that number means. Think about the logistics of 1,200 people mobilizing before the sun rose on a cold March morning in 1959. There were no social media alerts. There was no emergency notification system that could reach thousands of phones simultaneously. There was word of mouth. There were radio announcements. There were neighbors calling neighbors, co-workers calling co-workers, congregation members calling each other at home. And 1,200 people responded. Marines from the nearby base. Boy Scout troops assembled by troop leaders who made phone calls the night before. Utility workers who had taken personal days or simply shown up before their shift started. Mail carriers who knew the streets better than almost anyone else. Horseback riders from the surrounding farms and rural properties who could cover rough terrain that foot searchers could not access as quickly. All of them descending on west-central Spokane before the sky had fully lightened, gathering at the command post established at the intersection of Pettit Drive and the T.J. Minnick Bridge, right at the spot where Candy's scattered mint boxes had been found the night before. The United States Air Force sent helicopters to provide aerial coverage of the search area. In 1959, that was a significant deployment of resources. Helicopters were not common civilian tools. The decision to commit Air Force assets to the search for one missing 9-year-old girl says something about the weight that Candy Rogers' disappearance had already acquired in the public consciousness, about the pressure that community grief and civic urgency were already placing on every institution that had the power to help. The helicopters swept low over the neighborhoods, over the hills, over the river corridor, over the wooded areas at the edges of the city where a child might have been taken. They had no thermal imaging. They had no GPS coordinates to direct them. They were flying on hope and desperation and the thin logic of covering as much ground as possible from the air while 1,200 people covered it on foot below. They had so little to work with. A trail of mint boxes ending at a bridge. A partial fingerprint that could not be identified. A city full of witnesses who had seen girls in blue uniforms but could not say which one was Candy. That was the sum total of what 1,200 people and a fleet of Air Force helicopters had to work with on the morning of March 7, 1959. And then, on that same morning, just one day after Candy disappeared, the search turned into something even more devastating. A United States Air Force helicopter, flying low over the search area in the way that helicopters must fly when they are looking for a missing child on the ground, struck a set of high-tension power lines stretched above the terrain. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. The aircraft went down into the Spokane River. 3 crew members were killed. Airman Merles D. Ray. Staff Sergeant William F. McDonald. Lieutenant Kenneth G. Fout. 3 men who had come to help find a little girl. 3 men who had put themselves in the air above a cold river on a cold March morning because a 9-year-old child had not come home. 3 men who did not come home either. 2 others on that aircraft survived. The city of Spokane, already holding its breath for 1 family, was now grieving for 3 more. The weight of it was almost impossible to process. 3 men had died searching for Candy Rogers, and Candy Rogers had still not been found. The days that followed were the kind of silence that is worse than any sound. Tips came in from across the country. Hundreds of them, then thousands. Every one of them had to be taken seriously. Every one of them had to be followed. Detectives worked without rest, contacting anyone with a relevant criminal history in the region, cross-referencing names against known offenders, driving to addresses, sitting across tables from men who had done terrible things and trying to determine whether the terrible thing they were sitting across from was the specific terrible thing that had happened to Candy Rogers. In 1959, this process was entirely manual. There was no national sex offender registry. There was no searchable database of violent offenders that a detective could query with a set of behavioral parameters and receive a ranked list of suspects. There were paper files. There were phone calls. There were physical visits to addresses. There were conversations with other departments in other cities. It was slow, exhaustive, painstaking work, and it was the only work available. Several suspects were identified and investigated. None of them could be connected to Candy's disappearance with the kind of evidence that would hold up in a courtroom or even, in the internal judgment of the detectives working the case, clear the threshold of real certainty. 16 days went by. On March the 21st, 1959, 2 airmen from Fairchild Air Force Base were hunting in the woods off Old Trails Road, approximately 7 miles from Candy Rogers' home. They were moving through the trees near an old, abandoned rock quarry, the kind of place that exists at the edges of growing cities, left behind by an earlier industrial purpose, grown over with brush and pine needles and the particular quiet of places that people have forgotten to pay attention to. One of the airmen noticed something near the base of a tree. A pair of small girls' shoes. Not dropped in panic or haste. Not thrown down by someone running. Placed. Set down with a deliberateness that meant something, though the airmen could not immediately say what it meant. They did not stay to find out. They returned to Fairchild Air Force Base and reported what they had seen to the appropriate authorities. The following morning, a search party arrived at the location at daybreak. Moving through the trees in the gray early light, pushing through brush and low branches and the accumulated debris of a Pacific Northwest winter, one of the searchers reached down and pushed aside a pile of branches and dead pine needles. And there was Candy Rogers. She had been hidden under a layer of branches and dead tree boughs approximately 50 yards off the road. Someone had gathered that material, that particular combination of cut branches and accumulated ground debris, and had used it to conceal what lay beneath. It was not a shallow or careless concealment. It was the kind of hiding that takes time and intention. The kind of hiding that comes from wanting something to stay hidden, not just for a night, but for as long as possible. Retired Spokane Police Captain Richard Obering was one of the officers present at the discovery that morning. He would carry the image of what he saw in those trees for the rest of his life. He would never fully set it down. He would still be alive, still carrying it, 62 years later, when the name of the man who had put Candy there was finally spoken aloud with the authority of forensic proof behind it. Some cases mark the people who work them in ways that never fully heal, and the discovery of Candy Rogers on that cold March morning in the woods off Old Trails Road was one of those moments. The medical examination that followed was thorough, careful, and deeply disturbing. The cause of death was strangulation. The weapon that had been used to take Candy's life was not something the killer had brought with him. It was a strip of cloth torn from Candy's own slip, the white undergarment she had been wearing beneath her clothes when she left home on Friday afternoon. Her feet had been bound with another strip of the same garment. There was a distinct mark around her waist that suggested she may have been restrained with a rope at some earlier point, possibly during or shortly after the abduction, but no rope was recovered at the scene. Whoever had used it had taken it away or disposed of it elsewhere. The medical examiners also documented evidence of a physical violation that went beyond the strangulation, a dimension of the crime that deepened the horror in ways that 1959 had limited vocabulary to describe in public but unlimited capacity to understand in private. The child had suffered in ways that no child should ever suffer. The people in that examination room, the doctors, and the officers and the investigators who had spent 16 days hoping for a different outcome, were looking at the full, brutal reality of what had been done to a 9-year-old girl who had eaten an oatmeal cookie and played with her dog and talked about which neighbors would definitely buy campfire mints before she walked out her door on a Friday afternoon. Every piece of physical evidence was catalogued with meticulous care. Every biological sample, every fiber, every trace material that the technology of 1959 could identify and collect was preserved and labeled and stored. The investigators on this case in 1959 were not naive about the limits of their technology. They understood that they were working at the frontier of forensic science, that the tools available to them in that moment were not the final tools, that the science would continue to develop and what was beyond their reach today might be within reach tomorrow, or 10 years from tomorrow, or 50. They did not know how many decades it would take. But they preserved everything they could, with the care and discipline of people who understood that they were holding onto something that might one day speak when it could not yet speak. That decision, made in quiet professional judgment in a forensic laboratory in 1959, would eventually change everything. The discovery of Candy Rogers' body changed Spokane, Washington in ways that moved through the generations like a current beneath the surface of the city's life. Parents who had never thought twice about their children walking to a neighbor's house alone now stood at windows and watched. Rules that had been casual suggestions became firm requirements. Curfews that had been approximate became precise. The unlocked doors and unwatched streets of the Spokane that Candy Rogers had grown up in were not entirely gone, but they were different. They were shadowed by an awareness that had not been there before. The case entered the folklore of the city in the way that the worst things always do, not as a story that was told to frighten children, but as an understanding that was passed silently between parents, a knowledge shared in the way that adults share the things they cannot fully say aloud because saying them aloud would require acknowledging that the world is not, in fact, as safe as we need to believe it is in order to function. Spokane parents raised their children differently after March 6, 1959. And their children raised their children differently. And the echo of that afternoon carried forward in ways that Candy Rogers never got to know about. The detectives working the case had evidence. They had biological material. They had physical trace evidence collected at the scene. They had the partial fingerprint from the mint box. They held on to the belief, which took on the quality of faith over the years, that the science would eventually catch up to what the evidence was trying to tell them. The database would grow. The techniques would improve. The sample that sat in an evidence locker, carefully preserved, would one day be readable in a way that it was not yet readable. That day was coming. They were certain of it, or they had to be certain of it, because that certainty was the thing that kept the case alive when everything else had gone quiet. But before that day arrived, before the science caught up and the sample could speak, something happened that seemed, at the time, to be a breakthrough. Something that looked, from every angle available to the investigators of that era, like the answer. A serial killer walked into the investigation and handed the detectives a theory so compelling, so complete, so seemingly confirmed by available evidence, that it would close around the Candy Rogers case like a frame around a picture and hold it in place for the next 4 decades. And it was completely wrong. And while it was wrong, the man who was right, the man who had actually done this thing, was living in Spokane, working in Spokane, breathing the air of the same city as the family he had destroyed, and not a single detective, not a single tip, not a single witness statement, not a single piece of official paper in 62 years of investigation had ever contained his name. Now, before we go any further into the wrong turn that consumed 4 decades of this investigation, if you are still watching at this point, drop a comment right now that says I am still here. Let us see who is truly following this story, because what comes next is the part that will change the way you think about cold cases forever. Drop that comment. It matters. And keep watching. The man detectives came to believe had killed Candy Rogers was not a phantom. He was not a fabrication. He was a real and genuine monster with a real and genuine history of violence against women and children that was, in many ways, perfectly calibrated to make investigators believe he was the answer to the question that had haunted Spokane since March of 1959. His name was relevant primarily because of what he was, what he had done, and how precisely the pattern of his crimes seemed to match the circumstances of Candy's murder. The profile fit in ways that seemed, to detectives working with the information available to them, almost impossible to dismiss. And then there was the gum. It sounds almost absurdly small when you say it plainly. A piece of gum. A flavor preference. But in the world of criminal investigation, behavioral signatures, the small, consistent, repeating habits of a particular person across multiple crime scenes, can carry enormous evidential weight. And this individual had a habit. At nearly every crime scene connected to him, across multiple locations, across multiple years, investigators found grape-flavored gum. Not occasionally. Consistently. Consistently enough that it had become a known detail among the investigators who studied his crimes, a marker that linked locations and incidents and moments of violence to a single person the way a signature links a series of letters to a single hand. During Candy Rogers' autopsy in 1959, a detective made a note about a stain on her clothing. The stain was purple in color. When examined closely, the stain carried a faint but identifiable smell. Grape. That observation, recorded in a forensic notation on a case file in 1959, took on a life entirely disproportionate to its size over the following years. As investigators built a more complete picture of the suspect they had become focused on, as the pattern of his crimes became clearer, as the behavioral signatures became more established in the investigative record, that grape-scented purple stain on Candy Rogers' clothing became the linchpin of the theory. It was the piece that felt like it made everything else fit. It was the detail that kept the theory alive when other elements were less than certain. And it was never tested. Not chemically. Not forensically. Not with any scientific rigor whatsoever. It was an observation. An impression. A smell noted by a detective in a report and then elevated, over time and through repetition, into something that felt like proof. It was an assumption. And it was an assumption that calcified over 4 decades into something that everyone in the investigation had, at some level, stopped questioning. That is not a criticism of the detectives who worked this case during those decades. It is a description of how investigations work when the available technology cannot deliver certainty. Human minds fill the gaps. Patterns that seem to connect become connections that seem to have been proven. The theory becomes the frame, and everything gets arranged inside the frame, and the frame itself stops being examined because everyone is focused on what is inside it. For 40 years, the Candy Rogers investigation was inside a frame that fit precisely around the wrong man. Then came 2001. And everything began, slowly, to change. Detective Mindy Connolly had been assigned to the Candy Rogers case. She had come to it the way that detectives come to old cases, with the combination of fresh eyes and inherited certainty that defines the experience of picking up an investigation that has been worked by other people for decades. She had reviewed the files. She had absorbed the theory. She had seen the framework that 4 decades of investigative work had built around a specific suspect. And she had also noticed something that the framework could not answer. She had noticed that everything the investigation had concluded about who had killed Candy Rogers was built on assumptions rather than confirmed by forensic evidence. The grape stain had never been tested. The biological material collected at the scene and during the autopsy had never been subjected to the kind of analysis that was, by 2001, not only possible but routine. The science had arrived. The tools were there. And they had not yet been applied to the most important physical evidence in a case that had been officially open for 42 years. Detective Connolly submitted Candy Rogers' clothing to a forensic laboratory. The submission was precise and carefully documented. The material being examined had been preserved for more than 4 decades, held in an evidence locker, maintained with the care that had been applied to it since the moment it was collected in 1959. The scientists who received it understood what they were working with. They understood the age of the material. They understood the stakes of the analysis. They applied the most advanced techniques available to them, techniques that the detectives of 1959 could not have imagined, techniques built on decades of scientific development that had transformed forensic analysis from the discipline of observation and inference into something capable of reading the molecular signatures left behind by human presence. What came back from that laboratory began the process of dismantling 40 years of investigative certainty. The grape stain on Candy's clothing was not grape-flavored gum. It was not a behavioral signature linking her murder to the suspect who had dominated the investigation for 4 decades. It was something else entirely, something with no connection to the theory that had guided the case for so long. The single most important piece of evidence connecting the established suspect to Candy Rogers turned out not to connect them at all. The cornerstone of the case came out of the laboratory as rubble. But the laboratory had also found something else. Something that the clothing and the preserved biological material had been holding quietly for 42 years, waiting for the technology to arrive. DNA. Partial, aged, compromised by decades in storage, but present. Present enough to be profiled. Present enough to be compared. Present enough to be run against the databases that had been built, slowly and incompletely but with growing power, in the years since the science had made it possible to identify a human being from the biological traces they leave behind without knowing it. The sample was profiled. It was entered into the system. And it did not match the suspect who had spent 4 decades at the center of the investigation. The DNA told the investigators, with the quiet, absolute authority of molecular biology, that the theory was wrong. The man they had been certain had killed Candy Rogers had not killed Candy Rogers. And now they had a genetic profile of the person who had, a profile that could be compared, tested, and potentially matched, if the right name and the right sample could be brought together in the same room. The problem was finding the right name. Because the right name, the name that DNA would eventually confirm as the name of the person who had killed Candy Rogers on the afternoon of March 6, 1959, was a name that had never appeared anywhere in 62 years of investigation. Not in a tip. Not in a witness statement. Not in a police report. Not in a file of any kind related to the case. The man who had done this had moved through 62 years without ever drawing the specific attention of the people who were looking for him. He had lived in the same city. He had known the same streets. He had, in at least one documented instance, walked through the same search parties that were looking for the child he had killed, calling her name into the dark alongside the neighbors and the Marines and the Boy Scouts and the mail carriers. And nobody had ever written his name down in connection with Candy Rogers. His name was Hugh Byron Morse. He was not a stranger to the people of West Central Spokane. He was a member of the Spokane Motorcycle Club, the kind of community organization that in 1959 was genuinely integrated into the social fabric of working-class neighborhood life. Motorcycle clubs in that era were not what the term would later come to imply. They were groups of men who shared an interest, who organized rides and social events, who were known by name and face in the neighborhoods where they lived and worked. Morse was that kind of figure. Unremarkable. Present. Known without being particularly noticed. The kind of man who moved through social environments without generating the kind of friction or attention that makes people remember you. He was a background figure in the life of the neighborhood. He was there, and then he was not there, and nobody went looking for him in connection with a missing child because there was nothing about him that pointed in that direction. Except there was. There was something in his history that, if anyone had known to look for it, would have pointed very directly in that direction. For years before Candy Rogers walked out her front door with 7 boxes of campfire mints, before the cold afternoon of March 6, 1959, Hugh Byron Morse had been apprehended in California for attempting to molest 2 Girl Scouts who were selling cookies door to door. 2 little girls with a sales product, knocking on doors in a neighborhood, doing something wholesome and organized and completely ordinary. He had been stopped in California before he could do what he had set out to do. He had been apprehended and he had been charged, and there had been official record made of what he had done. But in 1959 there was no mechanism to make that record follow him across state lines in any way that would cause it to surface automatically in a local investigation. There was no national registry. There was no alert system. There was no way for the Spokane detectives working the Candy Rogers case in the first desperate days after her disappearance to know that a man living 2 blocks from her home had, 4 years earlier in another state, done something that was a direct behavioral rehearsal for exactly what had just happened to her. 2 little Girl Scouts selling cookies in California. 1 little campfire girl selling mints in Spokane. The echo between those 2 events is not subtle. It is precise. It is the kind of precision that forensic behavioral analysts call a signature, a pattern of victim selection and circumstance that reflects something essential and repeating in the way a particular predator operates. Morse had a type. He had a preference. He was drawn to a specific combination: young girls, organized activities, door-to-door sales, the particular vulnerability of a child alone on a porch or a doorstep, the moment when a small person is standing in a gap between a door and the outside world with a product in their hands and a practiced smile on their face and no awareness that the person looking at them is not seeing a customer. He had been stopped in California. But stopping him had not changed him. And 4 years later, in Spokane, Washington, on the first day of the campfire mint selling season, he had not been stopped. After Candy's body was found in the woods off Old Trails Road on March 22, 1959, the investigation intensified and the net widened and detectives worked the case with everything they had. And Hugh Byron Morse was part of the community during all of it. He was there. He was present. He may have attended the public gatherings. He almost certainly heard the news. He knew what the city was looking for and what it had found. And he continued to live his life in that city, in that community, on those streets, in that neighborhood, as though the terrible thing he had done was a thing that had been safely disposed of, buried under branches and pine needles and the limitations of the investigative technology of 1959. He was not finished. Less than a year after Candy Rogers' body was recovered from those woods, Hugh Byron Morse raped and murdered 2 women in Spokane, Washington. 2 adult women, killed in the same city, within the same period of time, by the same man who had killed Candy Rogers. And then he moved. He traveled east, moving across the country in the manner of a person who understands that distance is a form of safety, that leaving a geography behind is a way of leaving the consequences of what happened in that geography behind. He moved and he committed more crimes. At least 7 more violent incidents in other states, a trail of violence that stretched across the country and documented, in the most horrifying way possible, the continued operation of a person who had not been caught and had not stopped and had no intention of stopping until the moment when stopping became unavoidable. That moment came in Minnesota in 1961. A neighbor, an ordinary person going about their ordinary life, saw Hugh Byron Morse and recognized his face from a Federal Bureau of Investigation wanted poster. The poster was there because of the crimes he had committed in other states. It was not there because of Candy Rogers. Candy Rogers had not yet been connected to him in any official way. The FBI wanted him for other things. The neighbor made the call. Morse was apprehended. He was prosecuted. He was convicted. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences and he was sent to a Minnesota prison, where he spent the remainder of his life, which ended in April of 2003, when Hugh Byron Morse died. He died without ever having been publicly named in connection with Candy Rogers. He died without ever having been made to account for what he had done to a 9-year-old girl on the first day of the campfire mint selling season in 1959. He died in a prison bed, serving time for other crimes, while the case of Candy Rogers remained officially unsolved, while Elaine Rogers and her family lived with a question that had no official answer, while Richard Obering carried the image from those woods for decade after decade after decade. The forensic work that Detective Connolly had initiated in 2001 had produced a DNA profile. A real, testable, comparable genetic profile from biological material collected at the scene and preserved through 4 decades in an evidence locker. The profile existed. The database existed. The system for comparing one against the other existed. But Hugh Byron Morse was dead. And a dead man's DNA is not automatically entered into a database. The profile that investigators had extracted from evidence collected in 1959 could not simply look itself up and find Morse waiting on the other side of a database query. It needed a path. It needed a connection. It needed either a direct sample from Morse or a biological relative whose genetic material was close enough to the profile to indicate a familial relationship, a connection that would point investigators toward the right family tree and ultimately toward the right name. This is where genealogical DNA work enters the story in a way that has transformed cold case investigation over the past decade and a half, not just in Spokane, not just in this case, but across hundreds of unsolved crimes in jurisdictions throughout the country. The technique, broadly described as investigative genetic genealogy, uses partial DNA profiles from crime scenes to search databases of voluntarily submitted genetic material, the kind of material that millions of people have submitted to commercial ancestry services in order to learn about their family origins and their genetic health markers. When a partial profile from a crime scene appears in that kind of database, investigators can sometimes find not an exact match to the perpetrator, but a match to a relative of the perpetrator, someone who shares enough genetic material with the person they are looking for to establish a familial connection. From that connection, genealogical research can build a family tree. From that family tree, investigators can identify individuals who fit the profile, the age, the location, the available records, and eventually narrow the search down to a specific name. The work is painstaking. It requires both forensic expertise and genealogical expertise, both the science of DNA analysis and the human science of tracing families through records and documents and the accumulated evidence of lives lived. It takes time. It takes precision. It takes the willingness to follow a trail through generations of family history without knowing in advance where that trail is going to end. But it ends. When the evidence is sufficient and the work is thorough, it ends with a name. The name it ended with in the case of Candy Rogers was Hugh Byron Morse. The genealogical research, built on the DNA profile that had been waiting in an evidence locker since 1959 and refined through decades of careful preservation and modern forensic science, pointed investigators toward a family. The family led to a family tree. The family tree led to a name. And the name led to a man who had been dead since 2003, who had never appeared in any of the case files, who had walked through search parties and lived around the corner and participated in community life and served 2 life sentences for other crimes and died in a Minnesota prison without anyone in Spokane ever having written his name in connection with the murder of Candy Rogers. Until now. The DNA confirmation of Hugh Byron Morse as the person responsible for the murder of Candy Rogers was not a simple or instantaneous conclusion. It required additional verification. It required obtaining a DNA sample from Morse, which, since he was deceased, meant obtaining biological material from his remains or from close biological relatives willing to provide comparison samples. The investigative work required to reach that confirmation was significant and took time. But the conclusion, when it came, was not the kind of conclusion that leaves room for doubt. It was the kind of conclusion that forensic science at its best delivers. The match between the genetic profile extracted from evidence collected on March 22, 1959, and the genetic profile of Hugh Byron Morse, a man who had lived 2 blocks from Candy Rogers' home and who had, for years before her murder, been apprehended for attempting to do to 2 other little girls almost exactly what he did to her. When the confirmation came, when the name was officially, publicly, forensically confirmed, the city of Spokane went through something that is difficult to name precisely. It was not exactly grief, though grief was part of it. It was not exactly relief, though relief was part of it too. It was something more complex than either of those words. It was the experience of a community that had been carrying an unanswered question for 62 years, an open wound that never fully closed because it never had an answer, finally being told the name of the person who had caused it. It was the experience of an investigation that had spent 4 decades looking in the wrong direction finally looking in the right direction, even though the right direction led to a man who was already dead. It was the particular and irreducible complexity of justice that arrives too late to be fully justice, that tells the truth but cannot deliver the reckoning that the truth deserves, that confirms the answer but cannot put the person responsible in a room and make them account for what they did. Richard Obering, the retired police captain who had found Candy Rogers in the woods off Old Trails Road on the morning of March 22, 1959, was still alive when the confirmation came. He had carried the image from that morning for 62 years. He had worked in law enforcement for decades after that morning, and he had never stopped thinking about the case, never stopped hoping that the answer would come before his life ended. He was there when it did. He was alive to hear the name. He was alive to know that the person who had put Candy Rogers under those branches and pine needles had finally been identified, that the science his predecessors had trusted and preserved and passed forward through decades had finally spoken, that the open question which had defined a significant part of his professional life and his personal memory had received, at last, an answer. That is not a small thing. That is the kind of conclusion that the people who carry these cases for their entire careers spend their entire careers hoping for. Elaine Rogers, Candy's mother, had spent years living with the unanswered question of her daughter's death. The grief of a parent who loses a child is a particular and absolute thing, a wound that does not heal in any ordinary sense, that simply becomes, over time, part of the structure of the person carrying it. Elaine had that wound. She had carried it through every year that passed without an answer, through every development in the case that turned out to lead nowhere, through the 4 decades during which the investigation focused on a theory that turned out to be wrong, through the emergence of DNA technology and the hope it represented and the years it took to produce a result. The answer that eventually came too late for Candy, of course. It came too late for the 3 airmen who died in the Spokane River on the morning of March 7, 1959. It came too late for a great many of the people most directly affected by what Hugh Byron Morse had done. But it came. And the coming of it, the fact that the answer exists, that it can be stated with forensic certainty, that the 62-year silence finally has a word placed into it, is itself a form of reckoning that the case had been denied for 6 decades. There is something that the Candy Rogers case asks us to sit with that goes beyond the specific facts of the crime and the investigation, beyond the particular horror of what happened to one 9-year-old girl on one afternoon in one neighborhood in one city in 1959. It asks us to sit with the nature of time and what it does to justice. It asks us to think about what it means to preserve evidence with the faith that science will eventually be able to read what it cannot yet read, to carry a case forward through decades and generations and technological revolutions and shifts in investigative methodology, trusting that the truth is present in the physical evidence even when the tools to extract it do not yet exist. It asks us to think about the investigators who worked this case at every stage, from the officers who found Candy in those woods in 1959 and preserved everything they could, to Detective Connolly who submitted the clothing to the laboratory in 2001, to the genealogical investigators who followed the DNA trail to Hugh Byron Morse in the years that followed. Every one of them made a contribution. Every one of them added something to the long, slow, generational work of bringing the answer from where it was hiding into the light. It asks us, too, to think about what was lost. Not only Candy Rogers, though Candy Rogers is always the center and the heart and the reason for everything else in this story. But also the 3 airmen in the Spokane River. Also the years of an investigation pointed in the wrong direction. Also the particular loss that comes from a killer who died before he could be confronted with the truth, who never had to sit in a courtroom and hear the forensic evidence of his crime read into the official record, who never had to face the community he had violated, who was not alive to be named. Hugh Byron Morse died in a Minnesota prison in April of 2003, having been made to answer for other crimes but not for Candy Rogers. The DNA confirmation came after his death. The naming came after his death. There is a form of justice in the confirmation, in the certainty, in the public record that now exists stating with forensic authority that Hugh Byron Morse killed Candy Rogers. But there is also something that is not quite justice, something that the passage of 62 years and the death of the perpetrator before the forensic confirmation prevents from fully existing, a gap that the science can narrow but cannot completely close. What the case of Candy Rogers ultimately leaves us with, beyond the grief and the horror and the forensic detail and the investigative history, is something about the nature of persistence. About what it means to refuse to let a case go cold in the way that cold cases go cold when people stop believing that the answer is still findable. The detectives who preserved that evidence in 1959 did not know that DNA profiling would eventually exist. They could not have known. They preserved it because they understood, in the professional and moral sense, that it was their obligation to preserve everything that might one day mean something. The detectives who kept the case open through the decades that followed, who continued to work it when the leads had dried up and the trail was cold and the theory was wrong, did not know that genealogical DNA investigation would eventually provide the answer. They kept going because a 9-year-old girl had been killed and the person responsible had not been found, and that gap between the crime and the answer was not acceptable. The detectives who eventually obtained the genetic confirmation of Hugh Byron Morse understood that they were completing something that had been started 62 years earlier by people who were by then mostly dead themselves, that they were delivering an answer that the original investigators had trusted would come even though they could not have imagined how it would come or when. That chain of commitment, stretching across 62 years and 3 generations of investigators and multiple leaps of scientific technology, is not a small thing. It is, in its own particular way, a form of honor. The kind of honor that is paid not with ceremony or recognition but with work. With the choice to keep going. With the choice to preserve what might be useful even when its usefulness cannot be demonstrated yet. With the choice to believe that the answer exists even when you cannot find it. With the choice to pass the case forward to the next person and trust that they will make the same choice. Candy Rogers was 9 years old. She weighed 60 pounds. She had a dog named Shep and a grandmother who baked oatmeal cookies and a heart full of hope about earning a sales badge before the week was out. She ate her grandmother's cookie and played with her dog and said her goodbyes and stepped out into the cold March air with 7 boxes of campfire mints and a plan, and someone took all of that away from her on a Friday afternoon in 1959. It took 62 years, 3 generations of detectives, a glass jar in an evidence locker, the development of DNA profiling, the emergence of genealogical DNA investigation, and the accumulated, generational, unbroken commitment of people who refused to let her disappear without an answer, to finally say his name out loud. His name was Hugh Byron Morse. He lived 2 blocks from her home. He walked in the search parties looking for her. He died in a Minnesota prison in 2003 without facing what he had done to Candy Rogers. And then the science caught up. And the truth came out. And the name was spoken. And Candy Rogers finally has an answer. She deserved it 62 years ago. She deserves to be remembered now. And if you have followed this story all the way to this moment, if you have been here through every detail and every heartbreak and every turn this case took across 62 years of searching, then Candy Rogers was lucky to have you sitting with her today. Like this video. Leave a comment and tell us which part of this story stayed with you the most. Subscribe to Cold Case Beasts and hit that bell, because we will not stop until every case like this one gets the answer it deserves. The forgotten deserve to be found. We will keep finding them. We will see you on the next case.